next speaker up on the stage, we've got Christopher Biggs from Brisbane IoT, and he's going to be talking about, is it Shadow IoT? Is that right?
Yes.
Awesome. Have you got some slides to share?
Just
looks like you could just make do with whatever's in the background there. You could pull something together even if you didn't have slides. There's a real maker space behind you.
All right. G'day, everyone. I'm Christopher Biggs. And I, too, have been around for a long time and done a lot of things in the Brisbane IT scene. And a few years ago, I quit my day job and started a consultancy which focuses on Internet of Things. So here in Brisbane, we have a lab where not only do we build projects for people, but we offer a space for startups and interested people to come in and work on their own projects. And we host the Brisbane Internet of Things meetup. We do an evening meetup in the city, and we do a weekend meetup, for which the next one is actually this Sunday here in Brisbane, which is a thing we call Sunday Mad Science. So bring in your problem, work on it here in the Nerd Lab, and maybe create something great. And I think a lot about technology, past, present, and future. And there's a quote from Douglas Adams that went dirt ages viral back in the previous century. And that is that technology is stuff that doesn't work yet. And Douglas was paraphrasing a technologist, an artist named Brian Ferrin, and they were making the point that when things just work, we stop calling them technology. Nobody calls chairs technology because they almost never go rogue for no visible reason, unlike computers. So today I want to talk about what the business world could look like after technology stops being technology and just becomes an assumed part of the fabric of our lives. I'm thinking of a time when we deal with devices by the thousand or the million. And it's absolutely fabulous how easy it is to build internet-connected devices today, but there are a bewildering array of trade-offs and gotchas to consider when bringing these devices into an organized enterprise. So the bulk of what I'm going to talk about tonight is what these challenges are and how we might meet them. I won't go into depth on technology. I'm really going to talk about the philosophy of how do you bring IoT into an organization, maybe against the wishes of the powers that be, but how can we do this and how can we get the benefits of agility in the hardware space? But first I want to ask, what is the point? Why do we want to fill our homes and cities and buildings and even our bodies with connected devices and sensors? I mean, there are some drawbacks. To some people, the idea of surrounding ourselves with cameras and sensors that are always on and over which we have unlimited controls sounds frightening. It's been said that IoT devices are like vampires. Once you invite them into your home, you've got no power over them. You don't know what threats they enable. You have no easy way of examining or updating the software on them. It's like those sci-fi futures where the location and the behavior of everyone is being tracked at all times. Couldn't possibly happen here. Look, I won't argue that there is some awful security out there. I've given presentations in the past which go into all the scary details, and to coin a phrase, the awful truth is out there. But teething troubles come with every new technology, and I do think that the risks can and will be overcome. So let's look ahead to the benefits. What is the Internet of Things for? Well, in my opinion, IoT is for transforming our reach as individuals. It lets us ignore the known knowns and learn the known unknowns. That is, it frees us from having to worry about things. It lets us observe and control the things we care about from anywhere. We have a saying at Accelerando that our goal is to kill the clipboard. It also means we don't have to send kids down coal mines anymore. Well, we never really had to do that, but so much of history is about the folks with the biggest stick using it to get someone else to do the dirty jobs. But it's not just children. Long ago, the idea of enslaving those different-looking people from the other side of the mountains occurred to history's very first asshole. And even today, when you look hard, our homes and offices are full of tedious jobs, and in a disproportionate amount, of these still fall to women and other disempowered minorities. The developed world tends to implement equality by hiring an immigrant from a poor country or a young person who doesn't know any better to do the drudgery, the office cleaning, the factory work, the fruit picking. And this, I'm afraid to say, is just bullshit. Maybe we offshore the whole thing. Now, offshoring isn't always bad, but the key point is dignity. My rule of thumb is never outsource a job you wouldn't ask your neighbours to do. So we arrive at the final solution. Let's invent intelligent robots and get them to do all the dirty, boring jobs. Well, the way I see it, that process can end one of two ways. Either we succeed or we fail. If we fail, then we still need to find another way to make our world more comprehensible to non-intelligent stewards. But what if we succeed? How intelligent is too intelligent to be doomed to do a dirty, boring job forever? Ant equivalent, parrot, dog, ape, human, cat. So I give you this thought experiment. Is an artificial intelligence that is smart enough to solve complex problems, in fact, too smart to be ethically forced to solve them? Should we be paying our dishwashers a living wage? So what I think we should be aiming for is, in fact, artificial non-intelligence. I want to see machines meeting intelligence in the middle. And that's my motivation for IoT, which is making inanimate things smarter in order to relieve thinking minds from unpleasant tasks. Now, all of that has very little to do with what I want to tell you tonight, but quite a lot to do with why I want to say it. We've created a moment where, as an enterprise, as a person, as a nation, we have the power to do whatever we want with technology, for great justice or for great evil. So what will we do? Well, I've already said that we use technology, as we always have, to obtain benefits while avoiding unpleasant tasks. Now, in the software world, there's a fabulous example that hit the news just yesterday, where in the United Kingdom, they completely messed up their tracking of COVID-19 case numbers because it turns out that they had imported a bunch of data into Microsoft Excel and blown some size limit and deleted half of their case data. And the fact is that outside of nerd culture, Microsoft Excel runs the world because it's the tool that everybody has. It's the tool that they're allowed to use. They don't have to ask anyone permission to install it on their computer. So what does the hardware equivalent of that look like? What is the Microsoft Excel tool that everyone has access to in the IoT world, and what can we do with it? And you could argue that thing is eBay or AliExpress, whatever you can already buy off the shelf. So what do we care about as an organization or as an enterprise? Firstly, vision. Vision means seeing things that we need to see, knowing things that we need to know, having the information that we need in order to make the best decisions and avoid the worst outcomes. And this can be simply knowing the environmental measurements or your rate of resource use, or it can extend to monitoring the air quality, monitoring the quality of your output and managing your inventory. I like to say that the goal of an enterprise is to kill the clipboard. Anytime you've got humans walking around checking things off a checklist or writing down measurements, this is an opportunity to improve the process and get the humans out of that job. Why check your freezer temperature once a day when you can monitor continuously? Why sample your production line output when you can test every item? Why do a manual stock take if you can individually tag and track every item? Now, reach means being able to exert action at a distance, to be in control of your processes and machinery at every second with zero effort, to get humans out of danger zones like mines and foundries and loading docks. And right now, in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdown, we're learning just how much of our enterprise can be remotely operated, but also how many jobs still leave humans in harm's way. I bet the White House cleaning staff wish they had Roombas right now. And this leads us to autonomy, the possibility for processes and resources to look after themselves, rather than rely on our conscious centralized control. The role of human managers becomes to set policy, not to implement it. When we test a piece of safety equipment every 6 months, that means it might have been broken for 179 days the next time we need it. I had a fire here in my lab just last week, and we discovered that the fire extinguisher had actually failed and leaked away to emptiness. And it's been checked, but since the last check, it developed a fault. You know, nerds everywhere are excited about the self-driving car. But what about the self-driving McDonald's? For many organizations, efficiency is the key benefit, to be in control of your resources and processes, to the degree needed to minimize waste, to a far finer level of detail than would be possible through traditional technology. And so much of the way that we use energy in our homes and workplaces is based on the worst case, lighting and ventilating every room regardless of occupancy, applying coarse control because fine control has been intractable, deliberately erring on the side of caution. And if we automate all the drudgery, leaving humans the primary role of setting policy, then the best policy comes from superior insight. Measuring and analysing everything has the potential to create a new form of drudgery, that of sifting through the mountains of information in order to derive order from its chaos. And this is why I see information management as a fundamental part of the Internet of Things. IoT is more than just devices, it's more than information, it's also the technologies that connect devices and interpret that information. We not only mechanize the process of collecting information, our systems have to have the power to autonomously derive wisdom from that data. And this is where, for me, IoT has a fundamental antagonism to enterprise IT. Enterprise IT is driven from the top. Decisions are made by those most removed from the operational processes, with consideration of demonstrable benefit and alignment with the long-term strategy. Now, that's not a bad thing, but the potential for continuous improvement happens from IoT when it opposes these principles, when it investigates questions with no known answer, when experimental measurements allow rapid testing of hypotheses and immediate feedback on the value of process changes. IoT is a democratic technology in opposition to the autocratic technology of traditional IT. So to derive maximum benefit from IoT in the enterprise, we need to value agility and autonomy and accept that top-down planning is not always going to be the best approach. And this is definitely going to be in conflict with traditional organization and management. So now I want to spend some time examining that conflict and talking about how you can smuggle IoT into an organization from the bottom up. When some line worker or junior manager brings up the idea of incorporating IoT into the workflow, the first thing they're going to hear is some network administrator shouting, "Over my dead body, this technology is not safe for the workplace." Now, this isn't going to be one of those talks that just bleats about how everything in IoT is awful. It's unfortunately not inaccurate to say that everything is awful, but in my opinion, none of the general miasma of awfulness surrounding IoT is a deal breaker. In fact, I reckon these problems aren't even particularly unique to IoT. I happen to think that it's a bit like the American Wild West era. We're in a shortish period of historical turmoil where innovation and growth are running ahead of the law and of common sense. But what's different about IoT is the collection of risks arising from these products and technologies. So first I want to examine what are those risks and what can we do to avoid some of them. Now, our first risk is unauthorized access to your devices. If the device is a video camera, it's pretty clear what the concern is here. Embarrassment, violation, blackmail, burglary. In the business world, trade secrets and customer privacy are serious matters. You might have to worry about people who have a malicious interest in your organization in particular, disgruntled employees, corporate raiders, extortion gangs. I have to say that hiring private detectives to spy on takeover targets does happen. It's happened to a company I worked at. Secondly, we've got opportunistic griefing like ransomware, which is going absolutely apeshit in the business world right now. And finally, there's mass data collection, either by randos driving around sniffing for vulnerable devices or by state-level actors. We know that intelligent agencies have developed the ability to insert spyware into smart TVs and routers. We know that nation states are engaging in corporate espionage and election tampering. The next risk is unauthorized control of your devices. Cyber war is not a joke anymore. Orchestrated attacks on infrastructure and, in fact, entire countries are real. A few years back, the electric power company in Puerto Rico was estimated to be losing $400 million a year because an insider leaked the information on how to reprogram electricity meters by shining infrared light right through the plastic casing, bypassing all the tamper protection and locks on the physical device. Now, you might like free electricity and think it could be briefly funny if somebody works out how to similarly subvert autonomous computers into delivering free petrol or free groceries at the self-serve checkout. But it wouldn't really be so funny if all the traffic lights in the CBD went green at once, for example. Last year, we saw some serious consequences from unauthorized takeover of devices. I'm talking about Facebook being down for an entire afternoon. And I don't really have to talk about ransomware, do I? It's gone from theoretical to weekly. Big companies and even whole cities are coughing up all the money they saved by not upgrading Windows XP to some kid in no such thing in North Albania. And as a smaller enterprise, what if your delivery truck wouldn't start, or your reception video screen showed banner ads that you couldn't get rid of, or your lights started strobing on and off at random until you paid a ransom? And then, of course, there's plain old network intrusion. Most networks are set up to defend from outside threats, but what if you just brought a threat into the building in the guise of that IoT gadget that you bought off eBay? I'm sure you've all heard that story from a couple of years ago, which tells of a US casino that was compromised through their fish tank. That's an actual phishing attack, spelled with an F. So at this point, you probably just want to bury your head in the sand. Or maybe you want to round up all your IoT devices, go down to the beach, and bury them in the sand. And you've got some right to be concerned. And the potential for disaster is serious. And many devices on the market are finicky to install, they're poorly tested, they've got low quality user interfaces, and they've got no provision for appropriate maintenance. It's almost like we need corporate IT and their rules after all. Okay, I'm done scaring you for now. We've got a big list of reasons why we might want to use IoT and a bunch of reasons why established businesses might be reluctant to go down the IoT path. So let's look at the advantages that we have in our corner. Well, we have what I call the Iot Tripod. The three pillars supporting the Internet of Things are ludicrously inexpensive computers, pervasive wireless communications, and composable cloud services. These are the foundations on which we're going to rebuild our enterprises to be part of the fourth industrial revolution, the fusion of data and physical processes that let us do old things better and a whole class of new things besides. But what do I mean by ludicrously inexpensive? Well, let's take a simple task like making sure your freezer stays frozen. When you have $1 million worth of pork bellies in a warehouse, the price of a temperature monitoring unit from a traditional automation supplier, which could be over $2,000, doesn't sound so bad. After all, it's an insurance policy. If your freezer breaks down or starts to fail, you have a chance to do something about it before you lose all your stock. If you're a shopkeeper with $20,000 or $30,000 worth of stock in a cold room, or a cafe across the road from a courthouse where a spoiled latte might bring down the devil's own lawsuit, you might think hard about saving up that $2,000. But you might have a hard time convincing a CFO to spend that much to make sure the milk fridge in the warehouse break room is safe. Maybe there's a cheaper option. You can go to an office supply store or your telecommunications vendor and get a gadget for maybe $500. Or you can go to an internet gadget website and get something that'll probably do the job for about $20. So maybe the office coffee club decides that they're sick of lumpy milk, and this week the person who collects $1 from each staff member for milk collects $2 instead and goes and buys a remote thermometer so that nobody risks losing a week's work to food poisoning. What happens next? Well, in some workplaces, the answer is we discover that to our $20 sensor, we need to add $200 to get it tagged and tested, and another $900 to have an electrician come out and install a network port near the fridge. Then somebody in IT pipes up that you'll need to pay for a license from Microsoft Power BI and provision an SQL server. So we might discover that in some enterprises, ludicrously cheap hardware only pays off to its full potential if we can also find a way to lessen the cost of the software and management infrastructure. So our first challenge is powering our devices without paying through the nose. Power and communications are often linked, and sometimes we have one technology that does both. But I'm going to talk about power strategies first and then communications second, although I might get a little bit crossed over in the middle. Look, you can't beat wires. If you've got a power point in the right place, that's great. If your IoT gadget that you bought off the internet happens to have an American or European power plug, then the cost of getting it changed over might be prohibitive. And insurers do take a dim view of DIY wiring or using those dodgy travel adapters. So one key checklist for sourcing IoT products for the Australian enterprise is to make sure you get a power cable with the right Australian plug and devices that meet Australian standards. Now, I do know of some importers, I think John's checked out, but he's one of them, who have gone to the expense of attaining Australian certification for devices they import. So if you're rolling out enough of some product, that might be an option. But a heck of a lot of IoT devices are going to run at 5 volts or 12 volts. And that means they come with a weird plug pack that doesn't fit our sockets. You can chuck it out and get one locally. And again, you can pay an awful lot for this if you go to a traditional business supplier. So do cultivate a trustworthy electrical retailer who can supply power adapters that aren't going to break the bank. Now, nowadays, when an appliance runs off low voltage, it's almost using universal serial bus plugs. Now, officially, USB ports only need to supply half an amp, so that's 2.5 watts. But if you've got a camera or some other kind of gadget, it might need power than that. But there's all sorts of extensions, official and otherwise, that let you get more power out of USB. You can get up to 100 watts on paper, and I've actually calculated whether I could build a USB tea kettle for my conference traveling friends who get stuck in US hotel rooms with nowhere to make tea. But once again, if you're rolling out devices that accept their power over USB, you'll need to source a reliable USB adapter. And you might be lucky enough to find a USB port on the back of some machine that you want to monitor because it's used for diagnostics. So that's sometimes a sneaky way to steal power for sensors. I've got a few devices around the place that are plugged into spare USB ports on televisions because it happened to be a handy source of DC power. If you're using wired networks, you might as well run power over the same wire. If you've already got an IT infrastructure that uses power over Ethernet, that's great. If you don't, then there are some cheap options to retrofit power over Ethernet for just a handful of devices. You can get little dongles and splitters, which will let you inject DC power over your unpowered Ethernet, or you can get a thing called a mid-span injector, which lets you retrofit power over Ethernet to some of your infrastructure. Now, I design a lot of devices that are solar powered, and it's not as simple as you think. If you're out in the paddock or up on a roof or in the ocean, solar's great until it rains for a week. So we're really almost always talking about a combination of solar and battery. And whether you're designing and buying, you need to understand what's the worst case combination of latitude, aspect, weather, and grind you might encounter that's going to take your theoretical maximum power level and start making you cry. You'll see a number of off-the-shelf IoT devices that have solar panels, which, when you do the math, turn out to be so small that they are merely decorative. But having said that, there's actually some hope for solar panels indoors. Silicon solar panels are pretty lousy in low light, but there's a new generation of panels using other chemistries that can harvest power indoors. There's a group up here at the University of Queensland working on this problem using things called perovskite solar cells. Batteries. Batteries are simultaneously great and terrible. The first time I built a battery-powered IoT device, I was so pleased with myself. It had a big lithium-ion cell next to a tiny little circuit board, and all I asked of it was to warn me of rain in time to get the washing inside when faced with one of Brisbane's notoriously sudden afternoon rain showers. I tested it with a sprinkler and it worked great, so I connected it to the washing line and retired inside to my island of contentment. An hour later, it went flat. A little more research into power levels and battery capacity taught me that these products that manage to run for months or years on a battery typically do it by spending most of their time asleep and waking up at rare intervals. And if you need to be constantly monitoring, your battery life is going to suffer a lot. In fact, I think I can predict that the single most pervasive struggle that you will encounter when borging your building is going to be trading off your need to communicate with the battery impact of being online all the time. And your strategy for battery life is mostly going to be to work out how big of a battery you need and design for that, what to pick of a convenient battery size, and then work out how long you can afford to stay awake. Lithium-ion cells are great, and recharging them safely is pretty much a solved problem. And I could give a whole lecture on just batteries and power strategies. In fact, I did that last year in Christchurch, so you can look that up on my website if you're interested. There's also a number of obscure types of batteries which are designed for sensors that have to run for years without going flat. And don't forget plain old alkaline dry cells. When you're looking for something to deliver low power for a long time, these are still in the game. If you've got wired power, there's a good chance you can have wired network too, or you can just use Wi-Fi and not have to care about power requirements. Wi-Fi is great. You find it everywhere. If you're running on battery, you want to use it sparingly. But a little sensor that's just measuring temperature or moisture might happily get by with 10 or 20 milliamps when idle and just microamps when asleep, but need 150 milliamps when you're talking on the radio. So as a Wi-Fi connected IoT device, you're in deep sleep. You wake up, you take a measurement, and you're using 1,000 times as much power as when you're asleep. And then you need to transmit a measurement, and now you're using 10,000 times the power you were for a few seconds. So what else is there? Well, Bluetooth and Zigbee are both low power alternatives that have a place in IoT. When you have an air gap of only a few meters to cross, these can be ideal. And the newest version of Bluetooth has a thing called Bluetooth Extended Range, which claims to get the range up to 1 kilometer. So it might be possible that the balance of power in the range versus battery life is shifting in favor of Bluetooth again. One of my clients deploys sensors which spend most of their time asleep until they wake up in an emergency, and these things can go for up to a year on a single charge. And you've also got the option to create a mesh network of these devices, which can reduce the number of fixed uplink devices. The same project that uses those sensors uses a mesh network, and they have hundreds of these sensors across a campus, and only a handful of actual connections to the wired network. And there's a whole lot of things that I really hesitate to call IoT that use simple on-off signaling over radio. We're talking about the same technology that you find in garage door openers and remote control bed lamps or wireless security sensors. There's a number of radio bands that are reserved for low-powered, unlicensed communications. In Australia, we've got 433 megahertz and 915 megahertz, and also the 2.4 gigahertz band, which is where Wi-Fi and Bluetooth hang out. And I do use some of these dumb as a rock IoT, or perhaps not IoT devices in some of my projects. But one-directional communications can be a pain because you sometimes don't know whether they've gone flat, or you can't tell them to turn off, and they often have very little any kind of security built in. But there's a new kid on the block in these megahertz bands, a technology called LoRa, which is a spread spectrum protocol that lets many devices share the same frequencies. And there's a protocol called LoRaWAN, which lets you gateway this through to the internet. So you put out base stations every few kilometres or around your site, or you rely on the city already having done this, which is the case in parts of Sydney and Newcastle and a few cities in Tasmania. Not Brisbane, but certainly the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. I'm not actually aware of what the status of Laura Wayne is in Melbourne at the moment. We have a couple of global community-supported networks where you can install your own base station and help to build out the network into your city. And then there's cell phones. If you're tracking vehicles, you can get a gadget that's essentially a cell phone without a screen or a battery that powers off the vehicle. Your cellular plan, however, is going to cost you $20 or $30 a month. So you might fit one to a truck, but probably not to a dog or to a wheelie bin. But there's change afoot here too, and I probably don't need to say too much about this given the number of Telstra people in the audience. But there's 2 new cellular bands that are designed for IoT. They're technically 4G, but a lot of people bump them in with 5G. They're called LTE Category M1 and LTE Category NB1. So big props to the marketing people who thought of those catchy names. The point of these bands is that they use slower speed than phones, but they can reach further and they use less battery. And that means they can work in basements and factories where the cellular reception is traditionally pretty awful. And the plans are priced much lower. For a modest amount of data, you can be spending under $1 a month. So we're getting devices that cost under $50. They're smaller than a credit card, and they've got affordable cellular communications. And they can put cellular back in the game. Which is better, LoRa or cellular? I've been thinking about this for a few years, and I still can't decide. So we've decided to instrument our enterprise, and we've navigated the challenges of power and communications. We've maybe got several thousand devices out there that are communicating. But are they communicating with what? Are they all communicating, or did 5% of them go flat and nobody noticed? Cloud is magic, right? Look, normally I talk here about the options for building your own management framework or using one off the shelf, but I'm not going to. It turns out that the IoT ecosystems from Amazon and Google and Microsoft and IBM and others are all good, and they'll probably turn out to be essentially free for your shadow project. And there are a number of smaller players that have free tiers too that I've found are quite good. And the offerings from the big cloud vendors all use a protocol called Mqtt, which I'm also not going to talk about for reasons of time. But the big drawback with Mqtt is needing to be online all the time. If my battery-powered gadget requires me to spend 95% of my time asleep, then there's a good chance I'm going to miss a message that's addressed to me. And Amazon and many of the others solve this with what they call a shadow document. The device maintains its current state, and changes to that state are communicated via Mqtt. But the cloud server also keeps track of that state. And so the first thing you do when you wake up is you ask the cloud, hey, what happened while I was asleep? And anything that you needed to know about is synchronized through to you. The other thing that those cloud vendors give you is device management. You've got 1 million devices, you should have 1 million passwords, and that gets real old real fast. The cloud vendors solve this with digital certificates. The devices generate a secret password and get a certificate somehow from the cloud service. And these certified identities hook into access control lists. So, for example, your fish tank cannot go rogue and explode your missile base. Sorry, James Bond. But we as humans are bad at planning for long time frames. We've been trained to accept obsolescence in our phones. We get a little bit more irate when it's our TV or our stereo or our $200 million chemical refinery that stops working because the company that built it 3 years ago got tired of releasing bug fixes. So when you plan an IoT architecture like a radio station, you have to think for the long term. How long will these devices last? What's the mean time between failure? How many spares will we need? What's the plan for replacement when that day comes? What's your plan if the vendor goes out of business or gets bought by Google? Now, there are some IoT vendors who offer guaranteed support commitments. There are regulatory operations afoot to try and make this a part of consumer regulations. And one other thing that's worth looking at is there a hacker community around a product? If the vendor should go away, would you be able to keep it going on your own? One particularly pernicious problem you'll encounter is when a perfectly working device stops working because some network service it relies on has been retired. This has happened many times with book readers and music players and even light bulbs. So I really encourage you to be suspicious of IoT devices that rely on some network service that's operated by the manufacturer. I am pleased to see that Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and others are getting together to try and come up with a single framework that unifies all their incompatible rubbish. And I hope that that is the beginning of the end for pointless lock-in. In the industrial automation arena, pointless lock-in is bread and butter. Another of the reasons why I hope Internet of Things supplants some traditional IT practices. But no matter how well you plan, no plan is perfect. Needs change, threats change, so your architecture needs to be flexible. If you do, the idea that a system is perfect as purchased and then it's finished is probably bogus. If you didn't build something yourself, then you'll probably be asking the organization that did build it to modify it someday. It's 10 years from now. 5 years ago in 2025, you took $1 and shaved it into a million slivers and bought a kilogram of sub-milligram sized computers, which you mixed into the paint at your new office complex. More than half of them died, but you have about 400,000 nanocomputers sending data about noise levels and air quality and light levels and whether there's any new viruses in the air today. How do you cope with that much data? Well, I divide my IoT data into 3 categories: information about the devices themselves, aggregated information about the system, and application data. The cloud services that you use to provision these devices will help you funnel it to the right places and sort it by type. Presumably somebody wanted all this data you collected, so you build them a dashboard. Everyone loves a nice big supervillain screen like you see in the movies. They're pretty much useless. But you have to build them to work out what's useful and what's not. My opinion on dashboards is the goal is to ensure nobody ever has to look at it. And that goes double for your housekeeping data. My approach with performance and health data is just throw it in a data bucket and let it pile up. I don't even really bother to build visualizations. But when the wheels come off, when it turns out that the mutant slugs have been undermining your building foundations or whatever, you'll now know what you needed to know back then, and now you can start thinking about how to detect this class of problem next time. And there's a lot of exciting stuff that's been happening in the past few years around using neural networks and machine learning to detect anomalies. When I worked in e-commerce, we spent years trying to come up with rules to codify all the system behaviors to detect anomalies and outages. But now there's a good chance you can just get your group cloud provider to sniff your data and tell you if there's something smelly. So we have a population of sensors feeding into a data bucket somewhere. We're using machine learning, or at least artificial stupidity, to ignore the normal and highlight the abnormal. When the going gets abnormal, the next step is usually to page some poor sucker at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night so they can fix it. No thanks. So our goal is to have observations lead to decisions that lead to actions. And that means system A needs to be able to tell system B what to do, even if one is Microsoft and the other is Google, and never the twain shall meet. So the final gift that those cloud vendors give us is rules engines. If a sensor sees thing A and some other level B is in the purple zone, then open valve C. And you have a couple of choices when building rule-based systems. You can go all in on the cloud vendors with Amazon or Microsoft and Google and use their rules engines, or you can use a standard business intelligence tool, or you can build your own around an IoT-focused rules engine. Node-RED, originally from IBM, and now part of the JavaScript Foundation, is great and free. Thingsboard.io is another one that I really like and have been playing with recently. But now it's time to act. We've got to command some piece of our enterprise to do its thing. It's not perfect, but right now Mqtt is probably the least awful way to tie two disparate IoT systems together. Some slightly more awful ways include HTTP APIs or SMS messages or please no email. But there is a service that I hope you all know about called If This Then That. And one little news tidbit I want to throw your way is just this week they brought a bunch of new features to their free tier. So if you've looked at IFTTT before, I encourage you to take a second look. When I have two systems that don't quite line up, the duct tape I use to most often to tie them together is Node-RED. This is a flow-based programming system. It's kind of like Scratch for grown-ups. It knows how to talk to almost every protocol out there, and if you've got two systems that you need to get talking, there's probably a way to do it with Node-RED. In my lab here, it runs the door locks and waters the plants. I've got another system that's been running for years on an AWS free tier micro instance, and it cost me essentially nothing. It handles my Twitter bots and a bunch of other little side projects just fine. Okay, the last thing I want to do is circle back and talk about security again across all those places we've examined. And again, I could talk for an hour or more on security alone. And I did that, in fact, 10 years ago, just this January. Geez, it feels like 10 years. But I'm going to tell you my top 5 things. Don't put the fish tank on the same network as the financial servers. Your Wi-Fi routers are probably capable of running multiple networks, so do that. If you've got really crummy, cheap routers, you've probably got a guest network. Put your IoT on your guest network. Don't be lazy. Don't use default passwords. Don't skip encryption just because it's a pilot project and it's a private network. It's never a private network. Don't leave debugging backdoors in place. Whatever security you build will fail. So have a second tier. It should take more than one mistake for somebody to break in. Minimize the damage that a single compromised component can cause. Simplify reuse. That's 2 things, but whatever. Think about ants, not anteaters. There's good choices for operating systems and other components on embedded devices. Pick one and get good at it. For me, an IoT device has a common core that is well tested and well understood. And then a very simple set of application behaviors. Build your intelligence in layers. Don't stop learning, educate, and agitate about security. You're smuggling IoT into an organization to solve people's problems. So get your whole team involved. Maybe hold a hackathon. Find some stress-saving strategies. Get people involved in improving your processes. All right, that was far too much to cram into one presentation, but we have come to the end. To recap, for me, the point of technology is to relieve humans from endless drudgery, and the Internet of Things is how we bring the information revolution to the physical workplace. The one thing that makes IoT particularly hard is the time frames. When you set a computer in concrete, it really is forever. But don't forget, the goal of this is to make humans do less, not drown in data. And finally, better people make better products. Thank you.